You're standing in a museum storage room in Baghdad, 1938. A curator named Wilhelm König holds up a small clay jar, no taller than your hand, its surface cracked with age. Inside this vessel, wrapped in a bitumen seal, sits a copper cylinder with an iron rod running through its center, and what you're looking at might be the oldest electrical device ever made. I'm Jacob, and what happened next would split the scientific world. The jar that König examined that day had been excavated from the ruins of Kujut Rabu near Baghdad in 1936. It was made of clay, roughly 5 inches tall, with a mouth sealed shut using asphalt or bitumen. Inside, preserved in the dry Iraqi soil for nearly 2,000 years, was a copper sheet rolled into a cylinder, and at the center of that cylinder was an iron rod. The iron did not touch the copper. A thin layer of what appeared to be an acidic substance, possibly juice from pomegranates or lemons, likely separated them. To König, a German archaeologist working in Iraq before the Second World War, this arrangement resembled something he recognized from his own time: a galvanic cell, the basic building block of a battery. He published his findings in 1940 in a journal called Iranica, proposing that ancient Mesopotamians had discovered electrochemistry. The paper went largely unread during the chaos of the war years. But after 1945, as the world rebuilt and as scientific curiosity turned toward ancient technologies, König's hypothesis began to circulate among physicists and chemists who had never forgotten it. They wondered, could this clay jar actually generate an electrical current? And if it could, what were the ancients using it for? In 1954, a chemist named Arne Eggebrecht decided to test König's hypothesis directly. Working at a museum in Frankfurt, Eggebrecht reconstructed the Baghdad Battery according to König's original specifications and measurements. He used copper and iron in the correct proportions, filled the vessel with grape juice as his electrolyte, and connected the electrodes to a sensitive voltmeter. The result was immediate and striking. The reconstruction generated approximately half a volt of electrical current. Eggebrecht repeated the experiment multiple times, varying the electrolyte between grape juice, lemon juice, and vinegar. Each time, the device produced voltage. He published his findings with photographs and careful documentation, and suddenly the Baghdad Battery was no longer an archaeological curiosity. It became a technical puzzle. If ancient people could make this, what else might they have made? What knowledge existed and then vanished? The question electrified certain corners of the scientific and popular imagination. Television documentaries picked it up. Popular science magazines ran articles. Some writers began to suggest that the Baghdad Battery was evidence of a lost golden age of ancient technology, a civilization that understood electricity, and then, through some catastrophic cultural collapse, forgot everything. But even as enthusiasm grew, the evidence began to fray. Archaeologists started asking harder questions about context. Of all the Baghdad batteries ever found, only about a dozen have been recovered, and most of them came from private collections with unclear provenance. No one could say with certainty how old they actually were. The pottery style suggested the Parthian period, sometime between 150 BCE and 250 CE, but pottery is notoriously difficult to date precisely. Scholars like Ira Seligman and James Mellard examined the artifacts and reached different conclusions about their age. More troubling was the absence of any corroborating evidence. If the Mesopotamians had truly developed electrochemistry, where were the records? Where were the copper wires? Where were the artifacts that would indicate a technology had actually been in use? Ancient Mesopotamia left behind cuneiform texts on clay tablets documenting their mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine. They recorded recipes for dyes and metallurgical processes. They carved their achievements into stone. Yet there existed not a single text, not one artifact, nothing at all to suggest that anyone had ever plugged anything into the Baghdad Battery. This absence became the central problem in the debate. Even the supporters of König's hypothesis could not agree on what the device might have been used for. Some proposed electroplating. Ancient goldsmiths in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India did produce artifacts with remarkably thin layers of gold applied to copper or bronze. If the Baghdad Battery could generate a current, perhaps it powered a process for adhering precious metals to base metals without melting the base. But the voltage from a single jar would have been minimal, and to achieve electroplating at any meaningful scale, you would need multiple batteries connected in series, producing higher voltage and sustained current. The electrical knowledge required to understand that would imply a sophisticated theoretical framework, not a lucky accident with clay and fruit juice. Other researchers suggested medical applications. In the 19th century, electrical devices had been used in medicine as a supposed cure for everything from paralysis to depression. Perhaps the ancients had discovered electrotherapy in some form, but again, the evidence was speculative. No medical texts mentioned it. No human remains showed patterns consistent with electrical burns or treatment. The most skeptical scholars began to ask whether the Baghdad Battery was even a functional battery at all. Paul Craddock at the British Museum pointed out that the bitumen seal would have been permeable over time. If the electrolyte was liquid, it would have evaporated. If it had already evaporated by the time the jar was discovered, the device could never have worked in its excavated state. And if the electrolyte had evaporated in antiquity as well, then the jar would have stopped functioning thousands of years ago before it could ever have been useful for anything. Another possibility emerged from the work of Marian Wozniak, a scholar who examined whether the jars might have been religious or magical objects. In Mesopotamian culture, copper and iron both had symbolic significance. Copper was associated with the goddess Inanna. Iron, which was rare and extraordinarily valuable in the ancient world before iron smelting became widespread, was thought to have supernatural properties. A sealed clay vessel containing these two metals might have been a votive object, a ceremonial item placed in temples or tombs. It might have been a sacred object whose purpose was symbolic rather than practical. The frustrating truth is that none of these explanations can be definitively ruled in or out. The Baghdad batteries exist. They are real objects that persist in museums and collections. They can be measured, photographed, and tested, but their original context has been lost. Without that context, we can only guess. What makes the Baghdad battery so captivating is not the battery itself, but what it represents. It is a door that opens onto the question of technological loss. How much did ancient civilizations know? What capacities did they possess that we can no longer quite believe? In the modern world, with electricity permeating every moment of existence, it is almost impossible to imagine that sophisticated understanding of electrochemistry could simply disappear. We assume progress is linear. We assume that once knowledge is gained, it remains in the collective human library. But history repeatedly shows us that is not how it works. The Library of Alexandria burned. Entire bodies of mathematical and astronomical knowledge from the Islamic Golden Age were forgotten in Europe for centuries. The Romans built roads and aqueducts that medieval Europeans could not replicate, and they did not regain the ability to construct at that scale until the Renaissance. Technology is not like gravity. It is not immutable. It is a conversation between human curiosity and available resources, and that conversation can be interrupted. It can be suspended. It can be lost. The Baghdad battery sits in this strange zone of possibility. It is real enough to test, but mysterious enough to suggest that the ancients understood something we have not yet recovered. And whether it was actually a functional battery or a ceremonial object or something we have not yet thought of, the fact that it exists, that it was carefully constructed according to specific proportions, that it was sealed and preserved, suggests intentionality. Someone designed this. Someone thought it was worth making, and worth making carefully. Someone knew something. We just cannot quite figure out what. And that uncertainty, that gap between what we observe and what we understand, is precisely where the most interesting questions live. The Baghdad Battery is a reminder that ancient peoples were not primitive. They were thinking. They were experimenting. They were trying to solve problems that mattered to them. We may never know if electrochemistry was one of those problems, but the very fact that we cannot dismiss the possibility, that we cannot explain it away, keeps the door open. And sometimes an open door is far more interesting than any answer could ever be. The Baghdad Battery forces us to confront a possibility, that the ancients possessed knowledge we have not inherited, that some technologies can vanish completely, leaving only the barest trace of their existence. But there is one artifact that survived more completely, and what it tells us about ancient engineering is even more astonishing. In the next video, we are going to examine something pulled from the Mediterranean Sea in pieces. Something so complex that it took 120 years just to understand what we were looking at. It is called the Antikythera mechanism, and it may be the proof that ancient civilizations achieved technological heights we are only now beginning to comprehend. I hope you will join me then.